The Montana sky stretched endless and indifferent above Stillwater Creek, a tapestry of bruised clouds and fading daylight that offered no comfort to the woman stumbling from the stagecoach. Eleanor Pierce clutched her worn valise with trembling fingers, her breath catching in the frigid air of October 1876, each exhale a small ghost that disappeared into nothing, much like her dreams seemed to be doing. She had traveled over 2,000 miles with a paper promise and hope burning in her chest, now standing in the mud of Main Street with her future husband's eyes raking over her like she was damaged goods. That hope was guttering out, replaced by the familiar cold weight of rejection. "You didn't say in your letters you were sickly," Walter Hammond said, his mouth twisting around the word as though tasting something bitter. His weathered face, handsome in the daguerreotype he'd sent, now looked hard and unyielding in the fading light. Eleanor straightened her back, despite the pain that radiated through her chest. The journey had worsened her condition, but she wouldn't show weakness. Not now, not after everything. "I'm just tired from traveling, Mr. Hammond. I'll be right as rain after some rest." But Walter Hammond had already made up his mind, taking a step back, eyes darting to the waiting townsfolk who had gathered to witness the arrival of Stillwater Creek's newest mail-order bride. What they would witness instead was the beginning of a very different story, one that would change not just Eleanor's life, but the heart of a town that had forgotten what true strength looked like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The boarding house on Willow Street sat hunched at the edge of Stillwater Creek like an afterthought, its clapboard siding weathered grey by Montana winters and summer dust. Mrs. Abigail Winters, a widow with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, opened the door with visible reluctance, holding her lantern high to inspect the bedraggled woman before her. "Walter Hammond sent you here?" The older woman's gaze travelled from Eleanor's mud-spattered travelling dress to her pallid face, lingering on the handkerchief clutched in her hand, spotted with the telltale rust of blood hastily hidden. "He's decided our arrangement won't work," Eleanor said, her Boston accent standing out starkly against the frontier cadence of the West. "He's willing to pay for 2 nights' lodging while I figure out alternative plans." Mrs. Winter's mouth thinned into a hard line. 2 nights. That's mighty generous for a man who ordered you like catalogue goods and then changed his mind. She stepped aside, letting Eleanor enter the narrow hallway that smelled of lye soap and yesterday's stew. "Room at the top of the stairs. There's water in the pitcher if you need to wash. Breakfast at 6, not a minute later." The widow's voice carried a grudging sympathy beneath its hardness. "Hammond's a fool, but perhaps you're better for it. He buried 2 wives already." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her valise. 2? Childbirth took them both. He works his land hard and his women harder. Mrs. Winters shrugged, already turning away. "Rest while you can. Stagecoach East doesn't come through but once a week." The room was spare but clean. A narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a cracked mirror above it, and a single chair beneath a window that looked out on nothing but darkness. Eleanor set down her valise and sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of her situation pressing down on her chest alongside the familiar tightness that had haunted her since childhood. She had sold nearly everything she owned to pay for passage west, answering Walter Hammond's advertisement in the Matrimonial News with careful penmanship and desperate hope. "Respectable gentleman of means seeks an educated woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to leave Eastern comforts for frontier life. Age 20-30 preferred. Send correspondence to W. Hammond, Stillwater Creek, Montana Territory." What she hadn't written in her letters was that at 26, she had already watched consumption claim her mother and younger sister, that the Boston doctor had listened to her own lungs with a grim expression and advised her that the dry mountain air of the West might be her only chance. That after her father's suicide left nothing but debts, she had no other options. Eleanor opened her valise and withdrew a small tin of pills, swallowing one dry despite the bitter taste. The laudanum would ease the pain in her chest and help her sleep, but it wouldn't solve the larger problem. In 2 days, she would have nowhere to go and not enough money to return east. She didn't allow herself to cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she needed every ounce of strength to survive. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight streaming through the uncurtained window and the sounds of Stillwater Creek beginning its day. Wagon wheels creaking, a blacksmith's hammer ringing against anvil, voices calling greetings across the wide main street. Eleanor had barely slept, her mind racing through options, each less promising than the last. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a navy wool with only minimal signs of travel, and pinned her chestnut hair in a simple style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck while hiding how much of it had thinned in recent months. The face in the cracked mirror looked back at her with determination, if not beauty. High cheekbones too pronounced from weight loss, eyes too large in a pale face, but still with a spark of intelligence that had once been her pride. Mrs. Winter's breakfast was substantial. Cornbread, eggs and salt pork, but Eleanor managed only a few bites, saving the rest in her napkin for later. Economics has become second nature. I wonder, she began carefully as Mrs. Winters cleared the dishes, if you know of any positions available? In town, I have experience as a teacher and some training in bookkeeping. Mrs. Winters snorted without mirth. Stillwater ain't got much use for either. We've got 12 children of school age, and most of their fathers think education's a waste of good farming hands. As for bookkeeping, she gestured broadly at the muddy street visible through the window. Most transactions here are done with handshakes for bullets. Despite herself, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. Surely not all of them. Something in her quiet humor seemed to soften the widow slightly. There's the general store. Old man Jenkins might need help with inventory, and Doc Miller sometimes needs assistance with his papers, though he can't pay much. Doc Miller? Eleanor felt a flutter of interest. A doctor's office would be clean work at least. Traveling doctor, has a route through 6 settlements but keeps his main office here. Due back tomorrow or the day after. Mrs. Winters gave Eleanor an appraising look. He's a good man, odd but decent. Lost his wife in 67. If you're looking for another husband, I'm looking for employment, Mrs. Winters. Nothing more. Eleanor's voice was firm. The disaster with Walter Hammond had cured her of any romantic notions about frontier marriages of convenience. After breakfast, Eleanor ventured into town, the crisp autumn air both invigorating and challenging to her lungs. Stillwater Creek consisted of one main street with a handful of businesses: Jenkins' General Store, a saloon unsubtly named The Lucky Strike, a small bank, the blacksmith's forge, and a 2-story building with a weathered sign reading, Dr. J. Miller, Physician and Surgeon. The general store yielded nothing. Mr. Jenkins had already hired his nephew for the season. The bank manager had looked at her with thinly veiled suspicion when she inquired about clerical positions. By midday, Eleanor found herself sitting on a bench outside the doctor's office, resting her aching legs and trying to suppress the cough that threatened to reveal her weakness to any passers-by. That doesn't sound good. The voice startled her, deep, with a strange lilt that wasn't quite southern. Eleanor looked up to find a woman watching her with shrewd eyes. She was perhaps 50, dressed in practical frontier clothing, but with an unusual silver pendant at her throat that caught the sunlight. "Just dust from the road," Eleanor managed, straightening her posture. The woman smiled, unconvinced. "I'm Sarah Blackwood, town midwife and general meddler, according to most." She sat down beside Eleanor without waiting for an invitation. "You'd Be Hammond's mail-order bride, I take it. The one he sent packing because you look too fragile for farm life. News travelled fast in small towns. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Eleanor Pierce. And yes, though I prefer to think our arrangement was mutually dissolved. Sarah Blackwood laughed, a surprisingly warm sound. That's a charitable way of putting it. Walter Hammond is a walking coffin nail for women. You're better off, though I suspect that's cold comfort, given your circumstances. You're very direct, Mrs. Blackwood. Miss or just Sarah, and life's too short for anything else. She nodded toward the doctor's office. You waiting for Doc Miller? He won't be back till tomorrow evening. His circuit takes him to the Blackfoot reservation this time of month. Eleanor hesitated, then decided honesty was her best approach. I was hoping to inquire about employment. Mrs. Winters mentioned he sometimes needs help with his paperwork. Sarah studied her with new interest. He does, and worse at keeping accounts than a drunk prospector. Can you read and write well? I was a teacher in Boston, and I kept my father's books for his tailoring business. Educated, then. That's rare enough out here to be valuable. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Come with me. I'll introduce you to some folks who might have work, Doc Miller included when he returns. Eleanor hesitated. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Sarah Blackwood's expression softened, something like recognition flickering in her eyes. Let's just say I know what it's like to arrive in a new place with nothing but your wits and a body that's fighting against you. Her gaze dropped briefly to Eleanor's chest, where the rattle of congestion was becoming harder to hide. This territory breaks the weak and forges the strong into something new. I'm curious to see which you'll be. As they walked down the dusty Main Street together, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since stepping off the stagecoach, a fragile tendril of hope taking root. Whether it would bloom or wither remained to be seen, but for now it was enough that someone in Stillwater Creek had seen her as more than just damaged goods. What neither woman noticed was the lone rider watching from the edge of town, a guest, man with thoughtful eyes and trail-worn clothes, returning from his rounds earlier than expected. Dr. James Miller observed the strange pair with professional interest, wondering what new story was unfolding in his absence, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. James Miller dismounted his dappled mare with a weariness that had settled deep in his bones. 4 days riding between remote homesteads and the Blackfoot Reservation had left him with mud-caked boots, an aching back, and the familiar hollow, the feeling that accompanied treating ailments he could do little about. The Montana Territory demanded resilience from its inhabitants, and death seemed to claim the gentlest souls first. He led his horse to the small stable behind his office, noting with surprise that smoke already curled from the chimney. James had given his housekeeper the week off, expecting to return tomorrow, not today. He had cut his journey short after treating the last of the influenza cases at the reservation. Sensing an invisible pull back to Stillwater Creek, he couldn't quite explain. The back door to his combined office and living quarters was unlocked. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee mingled with something unexpected, fresh bread and the faint trace of lavender water. He set down his medical bag and followed the sounds to his front office. "You're back early," Sarah Blackwood said without turning around. She was organizing his shelves of medicines, something she'd been nagging him to do for months. "Good thing, too. Your newest patient can't wait much longer." Newest patient. James removed his hat, running a hand through hair more silver than the brown it had once been, though he'd only recently passed his 40th year. "I wasn't aware I had appointments today," Sarah turned, fixing him with the direct stare that had intimidated most men in the territory, but had always amused James. "She's not an appointment. She's a necessity." Before he could question this cryptic statement, the front door opened, admitting a gust of autumn air and a young woman carrying a stack of papers. She stopped short when she saw him, her composure momentarily broken by surprise. "Oh, Dr. Miller, I presume. I didn't expect—" She broke off, a cough threatening to escape before she swallowed it back with visible effort. James assessed her with the automatic precision of his profession. Mid-20s, underweight, pallor suggesting anemia, the slight hunch of shoulders protecting painful lungs, Eastern clothing, good quality but worn, and eyes, remarkable hazel, eyes with flecks of gold, watching him with an intelligence that belied her fragile appearance. "Eleanor Pierce," she introduced herself, recovering quickly. "Miss Blackwood has been kind enough to show me around town. I was just returning these." She held up the papers. "Your patient records were somewhat disorganized." "They were a catastrophe," Sarah corrected bluntly. "Eleanor has a gift for order. Look what she's done in just one afternoon." James crossed to his desk, examining the neat stacks where chaos had reigned before. Patient names were alphabetized, treatment notes consolidated, and billing records updated in elegant, precise handwriting. "Impressive," he admitted, looking back at the young woman who now stood with perfect posture despite the effort it clearly cost her. "Are you applying to be my assistant, Miss Pierce?" "She needs employment," Sarah answered before Eleanor could speak. "And you need someone to impose order on this place before you accidentally kill someone by misreading your own scrawl." Eleanor shot Sarah a look that mixed gratitude with embarrassment. "What Miss Blackwood means is that I'm seeking temporary work until the next eastbound stage. I have experience with record-keeping and some knowledge of medical terminology from my father's medical texts." "Your father was a physician?" James asked, interest piqued. "No, a tailor with scholarly interests." A shadow crossed her face. "He believed education wasn't exclusive to those who could afford university." James nodded, studying her more carefully, the slight wheeze in her breathing, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands, the careful way she held herself to minimize pain. "And what brings you to Stillwater Creek, Miss Pierce?" he asked, though Sarah's earlier comment about Hammond's mail-order bride had already given him the outline. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "A mistake in judgment, Dr. Miller. One I'm attempting to rectify by earning enough for passage back east." "She needs more than employment," Sarah interjected, ignoring Eleanor's sharp glance. "She needs treatment." "I'm perfectly—" Eleanor began. "You coughed blood into your handkerchief 3 times while organizing those files," Sarah cut in. "I've buried enough consumptives to recognize the signs." James saw the young woman's shoulders stiffen, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. Not against Sarah's words, but against the fate they implied. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward his examination room. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor nodded. "I have limited funds, but I can pay for your consultation. We'll discuss." "And payment after," James said, holding the door for her. To Sarah, he added, "Would you mind brewing a fresh pot of coffee? I suspect we'll all need it." The examination confirmed what James had suspected. Eleanor Pierce was in the early stages of consumption, what medical journals were now calling tuberculosis. Her lungs showed telltale signs, though the disease hadn't yet progressed to the advanced stage. "The doctor in Boston gave me 6 months, Eleanor said matter-of-factly, as she rebutted the high collar of her dress. "That was 4 months ago. He suggested the mountain air might extend that estimate." "He wasn't wrong," James replied, washing, his hands in the basin. "The dry air here is better than the dampness of the East. With proper care, nutrition, and rest, you could see significant improvement." "Those are luxuries I can't afford, Doctor." Her voice held no self-pity, just pragmatism. "I need to work, and according to Mrs. Winters, the eastbound stage arrives in 5 days. James dried his hand slowly, considering the woman before him. In his 15 years of practice, first as an army surgeon during the war and later as a frontier doctor, he had learned to recognize exceptional strength when he encountered it. Eleanor Pierce possessed it in abundance, alongside an education and competence that were rare in these parts. "I need an assistant," he said finally. "Someone to maintain my records, prepare simple medicines, and mind the office when I'm on my circuit. The position includes room and board. There's a small apartment above the office that my last assistant used." Eleanor's expression betrayed cautious hope mingled with suspicion. "You're offering me employment despite my condition." "I'm offering you employment because of your competence," James corrected. "Your condition is a separate matter that we'll address as doctor and patient." "I don't want charity, Dr. Miller." "Good, because I'm not offering any. This territory has a shortage of educated people who can read my handwriting and understand medical terminology. I've needed a proper assistant since Mrs. Gardner left to care for her daughter in Helena." He gestured to the newly organized files. "You've done more in one afternoon than my temporary helpers have managed in months." Eleanor studied him, clearly trying to determine if he was being truthful or merely kind. Finally, she asked, "What would my duties include specifically?" "Office management, inventory of supplies, basic preparation of tinctures and tonics. I can teach you the formulas, occasionally assisting with treatments if you're comfortable doing so." He paused. "The work isn't strenuous, but it requires precision and intelligence. Based on these files, you have both." "And my health will be monitored and treated as part of your compensation," James said firmly. "Fresh air, proper nutrition, and certain medications can significantly improve your prognosis. The apartment upstairs catches the morning sun and has excellent ventilation." Eleanor's hands twisted together briefly before she stilled them. "May I think about it overnight? I don't wish to make another hasty decision." "Of course," James nodded, respecting her caution, "though I should mention that if you accept, your first task would be accompanying me to the Anderson homestead tomorrow. Their youngest has a fever that needs checking, and you could assist with recording treatments and inventory." A smile flickered across Eleanor's face, the first genuine one he'd seen. "You seem very confident I'll accept your offer, Doctor." "I'm confident you're practical, Miss Pierce. And practical people recognize good opportunities, even when they arrive unexpectedly." He extended his hand. "Shall we say 9 o'clock tomorrow for your decision?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before shaking his hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm despite her fragility. 9 o'clock, she agreed. After she had departed with Sarah Blackwood, who promised to help her collect her things from the boarding house, James sat heavily in his office chair. He wasn't entirely sure what had prompted his impulsive offer. The practice certainly needed help, but taking on an assistant with consumption carried complications he hadn't planned for. Yet something about Eleanor Pierce, her quiet dignity, her intelligence, her refusal to be defined by her illness, had stirred something in him he thought had died with his wife 8 years ago. Not romantic interest, he assured himself, but professional respect, and perhaps a recognition of a kindred spirit. James pulled a leather journal from his desk drawer and began to write notes on potential treatments. If Eleanor Pierce accepted his offer, he was determined to prove that her life wasn't measured in the months a Boston doctor had allotted her, but in the strength of her will to survive against all odds. Outside his window, Stillwater Creek continued its daily rhythms, unaware that the arrival of one rejected mail-order bride might change not only her fate, but that of the solitary doctor who had forgotten how to hope. Dawn broke over Stillwater Creek in shades of amber and rose, painting the modest buildings with a gentle light that belied the harsh realities of frontier life. Eleanor stood at the window of her small room at the boarding house, watching the town stir to life while her few possessions lay packed in her valise. She hadn't slept well, her mind turning over Dr. Miller's offer, like a miner examining an unexpected nugget for authenticity. The position offered salvation of a sort. Work that wouldn't strain her weakening body, accommodation that wouldn't deplete her dwindling funds, and most precious of all, medical care from a physician who hadn't immediately written her off as doomed. But experience had taught Eleanor that unexpected kindness often carried hidden costs. Walter Hammond's letters had promised companionship and security, only to deliver rejection. Her father's scholarly friends had promised assistance after his death, only to disappear when his debts were revealed. Even the Boston doctor who diagnosed her had initially promised treatments he later admitted were merely palliative. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Winters stood there, a plate of biscuits and preserves in hand. "Thought you might want something before you head over to the doctor's," the widow said, setting the plate on the small dresser. "Sarah Blackwood told me about his offer." "News travels quickly here," Eleanor observed, accepting the food with gratitude. She'd need her strength today, regardless of her decision. Mrs. Winters settled her substantial frame on the edge of the bed, watching Eleanor with keen eyes. "That's the blessing and curse of small towns. No secrets, but no suffering alone either." "And what's the town's opinion on Dr. Miller? Is he trustworthy?" Eleanor asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Winters snorted. "James Miller is the most honorable man in 3 counties. Stubborn as a mule and about as sociable as one too, but his word is iron. If he offered you that position, it's because he needs the help, not out of pity." The assessment aligned with Eleanor's own impressions, though she'd seen something in the doctor's eyes that suggested more complexity than mere stubbornness. A shadow of old grief, perhaps, or the weight of too many battles lost to death on the frontier. "I'm inclined to accept," Eleanor admitted, "though I worry my condition may eventually become a burden rather than an asset to his practice." Mrs. Winters waved a dismissive hand. "That man has treated everything from mining accidents to Blackfoot arrow wounds. Having an assistant who occasionally needs to sit down won't trouble him." Her expression softened slightly. "Besides, if anyone can help with your lungs, it's him. Lost his wife to fever in '67, then devoted himself to studying every disease that crosses these territories." This new information settled something in Eleanor's mind. A man acquainted with loss might better understand the urgency that drove her, not fear of death itself, but fear of leaving nothing meaningful behind when it came. At precisely 9:00, Eleanor knocked on the door of Dr. Miller's office, valise in hand. Her decision was made, though caution still tempered her hope. The doctor answered immediately, as though he'd been waiting. His appearance had transformed since yesterday. The trail dust gone, his clothes fresh, his silver-streaked hair neatly trimmed. Only the shadows beneath his eyes suggested he might have spent the night working rather than resting. "Miss Pierce," he greeted her, genuine pleasure warming his voice. "You've decided to accept, provisionally," Eleanor qualified, stepping inside. The office already looked different. Cleaner, more organized, suggesting he'd worked through the night preparing for her arrival. "I propose a 2-week trial period. If either of us finds the arrangement unsuitable, we part ways with no ill feelings." James Miller's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Negotiating terms already? Very well. 2 weeks." He gestured toward the newly cleared desk in the corner. "That would be your workspace. I took the liberty of preparing the apartment upstairs as well." Eleanor set down her valise. "Before we proceed, Dr. Miller, I need complete honesty between us. My condition will worsen eventually. There may come a time when I cannot fulfill my duties." "I'm aware," he replied, his expression turning serious. "And in the spirit of honesty, you should know that my practice often takes me away for days at a time. The work can be irregular and demanding. Then we understand each other. I believe we do. He offered his hand, and they shook on the agreement. A simple gesture that somehow felt more binding than the elaborate correspondence that had brought her to Walter Hammond. The morning passed in orientation. Dr. Miller showed Eleanor his system of record-keeping, such as it was, his medicine storage woefully disorganized, and his laboratory set-up for preparing treatments, surprisingly modern and well-equipped. He explained the common ailments of the region, from mining lung to childbed fever, from frostbite to snake venom. Eleanor absorbed it all with the quick mind that had once made her an effective teacher. When he quizzed her on the contents of various bottles, she recalled nearly everything correctly. "You have an excellent memory," he noted, impressed. "Necessity rather than natural gift," she replied. "When one teaches 30 children of different ages in a single room, one must remember who's learned what." By noon, they had established a working routine that felt surprisingly natural. Eleanor would maintain records, prepare basic remedies under supervision, and manage appointments. Dr. Miller would handle examinations, complex treatments, and house calls to distant patients. "Speaking of which," he said, checking his pocket, "watch. We should head to the Anderson homestead. Are you up for the journey? It's about an hour by wagon." Eleanor hesitated, assessing her body's reserves honestly. "Yes, though I may need to rest afterward." "Fair enough." He studied her thoughtfully. "Before we go, I'd like you to try something." From a cabinet, he withdrew a small brown bottle. "This is a tincture of my own design. White pine bark, wild cherry, and several other ingredients that help ease lung complaints. 2 drops in water, 3 times daily." Eleanor accepted the bottle, recognizing that this was more than just medication. It was the beginning of her treatment as his patient. "Thank you." The Anderson homestead sat nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills, a sturdy log cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and chickens scratching in the yard. A girl of about 8 ran out to meet the wagon as they approached, her blonde braids bouncing. "Doc Miller, Ma says the baby's fever broke this morning." James smiled at the child, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "That's good news, Lizzie. We'll still check on him, though." Inside, they found Mrs. Anderson, a careworn woman in her 30s, cradling an infant who looked considerably healthier than Dr. Miller had evidently expected. "He started improving right after you left yesterday," she explained, allowing the doctor to examine the baby boy. "That willow bark tea worked miracles." "The human body works miracles, Mrs. Anderson. The tea just helps it along." James completed his examination, nodding with satisfaction. "The fever's gone, and his lungs sound clear. Continue the tea for another day, then regular feeding should suffice." Eleanor stood quietly nearby, observing the doctor's gentle manner with both mother and child. When he introduced her as his new assistant, Mrs. Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly, her gaze taking in Eleanor's Eastern dress and delicate appearance. "You're the one Hammond rejected?" she asked bluntly, frontier directness overriding politeness. Eleanor forced a smile. "Yes, though I find myself grateful for his decision now." Mrs. Anderson snorted. "You dodged a bullet there. Hammond works his land and his people to the bone." She bounced the baby gently. "This little one would be my 6th in 7 years if I'd married someone like him." On the ride back to town, Eleanor found herself oddly comfortable with the silence that fell between them. Dr. Miller drove with confidence, his hands steady on the reins, occasionally pointing out medicinal plants growing alongside the road. "The Andersons seem like good people," she ventured finally. He nodded. "Salt of the earth. Lost 2 children to diphtheria before I arrived in the territory. Tom Anderson rode 3 days through a blizzard to fetch me when his wife went into labor with this one. The people here trust you deeply." "Trust is the most valuable currency in places like this," he replied. "More than gold or medicine." Eleanor considered this. Yet they were quick to believe Walter Hammond when he implied I was damaged goods, unfit for frontier life. James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "People believe what confirms their existing fears, Miss Pierce. Many here have watched loved ones succumb to illness. Your fragility reminds them of their vulnerability." "I'm more than my illness," she said quietly. "I know." His voice held absolute certainty. "That's why you're sitting beside me, instead of on the eastbound stage." Something in his simple acknowledgement of her worth, beyond her physical limitations, touched Eleanor deeply. For the first time since arriving in Stillwater Creek, she felt the constriction in her chest ease slightly. Not from medication, but from the profound relief of being truly seen. As they approached town, the sunset painted the modest buildings in gold. Eleanor looked at the doctor's office, her new workplace and home, and allowed herself to consider a possibility that had seemed unthinkable just days ago. That her journey west had not been a terrible mistake after all, but perhaps the beginning of something unexpected. What she couldn't know was how her arrival had already begun to shift something in the quiet doctor beside her, awakening questions and possibilities he had long ago set aside in favor of solitude and duty. October gave way to November, bringing bitter winds that swept down from the mountains and painted the world in shades of grey and brown. The first light snow dusted Stillwater Creek, transforming the muddy streets into a briefly pristine landscape before hooves and boots churned it into slush. Eleanor had been Dr. Miller's assistant for 3 weeks now, a week past their agreed trial period. Neither had mentioned terminating the arrangement, their working relationship settling into a comfortable rhythm that benefited them both. The doctor's records were now impeccably maintained, his supplies organized and inventoried, and his schedule managed with an efficiency that allowed him to see more patients than before. For Eleanor, the benefits were equally tangible. The apartment above the doctor's office was small but comfortable, with southern-facing windows that captured whatever sunlight the Montana winter allowed. The wood stove kept it warm, and the distance from the ground meant less dust irritated. Her lungs, Dr. Miller's tincture, taken faithfully 3 times daily, had reduced her coughing fits, and the regular meals, simple but nutritious, had added a small but noticeable amount of weight to her frame. Most importantly, she had purpose again. Each patient record completed, each tincture mixed, each frightened child calmed. While Dr. Miller treated their parents, these small victories accumulated, giving her days meaning beyond merely surviving another sunrise. On this particular morning, Eleanor was cataloguing a shipment of medical supplies that had finally arrived from Helena when the office door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and a frantic young man with a blood-soaked bandage around his hand. "Doc Miller," he gasped, looking desperately around the office. "He's on a house call at the Taylor farm," Eleanor said calmly, already moving to the examination room. "I'm his assistant. Come through here, please." The young man, barely 20, with the muscled build of someone who worked in the lumber camp north of town, hesitated only briefly before following. "Cut it on a saw," he explained, holding up the injured hand. "Boss said to get it stitched, quickly, or I'll lose work days." Eleanor gestured for him to sit on the examination table while she gathered supplies. Dr. Miller had shown her how to prepare for different treatments, though she had only observed, never performed them herself. "I'm Miss Pierce," she said, beginning to unwrap the crude bandage. "And you are?" "Matthew Doyle, ma'am." He winced as the last layer of cloth pulled away, revealing a deep gash across his palm. "Bad, ain't it?" Eleanor assessed the wound with outward composure that belied her inner concern. The cut was deep but clean, slicing across the palm below the thumb. It would definitely need stitches, and Dr. Miller wouldn't return for hours. Mr. Doyle, Dr. Miller taught me to clean and prepare wounds, but I'm not trained to suture. She began washing the cut with carbolic solution. However, I can clean this properly and apply a better bandage until he returns. Matthew's face fell. Can't wait that long, ma'am. If I don't get back to work by tomorrow, I'll lose my position. Winter's coming, and there's 20 men waiting for each job. Eleanor bit her lip, weighing her options. She had watched Dr. Miller perform sutures numerous times, and had even practiced on pieces of leather when he wasn't looking. The procedure wasn't particularly complex, just precise. "I understand your situation, Mr. Doyle," she said finally. "I've observed this procedure many times. If you're willing to take the risk of my inexperience, I can attempt to suture the wound." Matthew looked at her skeptically, taking in her delicate appearance. "You sure you're up to it, ma'am? No offense, but you look like a strong wind might blow you over." A familiar flicker of determination sparked in Eleanor. "My physical condition has no bearing on my steady hands or quick mind, Mr. Doyle. But the choice is yours." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Do what you can. I trust Doc wouldn't keep you here if you didn't know your business." Eleanor prepared everything meticulously, sterilizing the curved needle as Dr. Miller had taught her, arranging the catgut sutures, preparing a dose of laudanum for the pain. Her movements were deliberate and calm despite her racing heart. "This will hurt," she warned Matthew, administering the laudanum. "The medicine will help, but it won't eliminate the pain entirely." "I've had worse," he assured her, though his white-knuckled grip on the edge of the table suggested otherwise. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying her hands, then began. The first stitch was the hardest, requiring her to pierce the angry flesh with enough force to draw the edges together. Matthew hissed but didn't move. The second stitch was easier, her confidence growing as muscle memory from her practice took over. By the sixth and final stitch, her movements were smooth and precise. She tied off the suture and cut the excess thread, then applied a salve of calendula and yarrow that Dr. Miller had taught her to prepare for wound healing. "There," she said, wrapping clean bandages around Matthew's hand. "Change the dressing daily and keep it dry. If you notice increased redness, heat, or discharge, return immediately." Matthew examined her work with surprise and respect. "Neater than the stitches I got from the army surgeon after Antietam," he remarked. "Much obliged, Miss Pierce." As she was giving Matthew instructions for wound care, the office door opened again. Dr. Miller entered, shaking snow from his coat, then stopped short at the scene before him. "Mr. Doyle," he acknowledged, his eyes moving to the fresh bandage, then to Eleanor's face. "I see you've been attending to it already." "Your assistant here did a fine job, Doc," Matthew said, standing. "Stitch me up neat as you would have." James raised an eyebrow at Eleanor, but said nothing until Matthew had paid his fee and departed. Then he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You performed sutures." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes. He couldn't wait until your return. His livelihood was at stake." "Show me your work." She led him to the examination room, explaining her procedure step by step as she cleaned up the used supplies. When she finished, she stood straight, prepared for rebuke, but not regret. "I made a judgment call. If it was inappropriate, I accept full responsibility." To her, surprise, a slow smile spread across James's face. "Your stitches are better than mine were my first year of medical practice." "You're not angry. Should I be? You helped a patient who needed care, used proper technique, and likely saved him from infection and loss of work." He hung his coat on the rack. "Though I am curious how you learned to suture so well when I've never taught you." Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks. "I practiced on leather scraps when you were away. I thought it might be useful to know." James studied her with new interest. Most women would faint at the mere thought of stitching human flesh. I'm not most women, Eleanor replied simply. No, he agreed, his voice softening. You certainly are not. That evening, after the office closed, James invited Eleanor to join him for dinner in his private quarters behind the practice. It was the first time he had extended such an invitation, their meals previously taken separately, despite sharing the building. His living space reflected the man, practical, unadorned, but with unexpected touches of refinement. Medical journals, shared shelf space with volumes of poetry, a battered chess set sat by the window, and on the mantel a single photograph in a silver frame, a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression. My wife, Caroline, James explained when he caught Eleanor looking at it. She died in 67. Mrs. Winters mentioned it. I'm sorry for your loss. Eleanor accepted the bowl of stew he offered. May I ask what happened? James settled into his chair, his face momentarily shadowed. Typhoid. We were at a frontier outpost in Wyoming. I was the only doctor for 100 miles, treating a dozen cases. His voice grew quiet. I saved 9 of them, but not her. Eleanor understood then what drove this solitary man to ride through blizzards and risk hostile territories to reach patients. Not just duty, but atonement. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. A doctor is supposed to heal, he replied, especially those closest to him. And a teacher is supposed to protect her students, Eleanor countered. Yet I watched 3 die of diphtheria before Boston officials closed the school. We can only do what's within our power. Something passed between them then. A recognition of shared burden, of understanding that went beyond words. James cleared his throat and changed the subject. Your suturing today makes me think you might have an aptitude for medical work beyond record-keeping. Would you be interested in more formal training? Eleanor's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? Learning examination techniques, diagnosis, basic treatments. There are few doctors in this territory, and many people go without. Care because I can't be everywhere. He leaned forward, suddenly animated. You have the intelligence and steadiness required. With training, you could help far more people than just by keeping my records. The offer stunned her. Women physicians were rare even in the East, where medical colleges for women had only recently been established. Here on the frontier, the idea seemed almost revolutionary. You would teach me medicine? She asked carefully. What I know of it? Yes, not to replace proper medical training, but enough to be useful. He seemed almost embarrassed by his enthusiasm. Consider it an extension of your duties, with compensation adjusted accordingly. Eleanor thought of the satisfaction she'd felt helping Matthew Doyle, the sense of purpose it had given her. Then she thought of her illness, the unknown time left to her. I would like that very much, she said finally. But we must be practical. My condition will progress at its own rate, regardless of whether you spend your days filing papers or learning to set broken bones, James interrupted gently. The question is how you wish to use the time you have. Put that way, the answer was simple. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. When do we begin? We already have, he replied, raising his cup to her in a quiet toast. Neither of them noticed Sarah Blackwood watching from outside the window, a knowing smile on her face as she turned and walked back toward town, her silver pendant catching the moonlight. Winter descended on Stillwater Creek with unforgiving force. December brought snowdrifts taller than a man and temperatures that froze water buckets solid inside homes. The townspeople hunkered down, venturing out only for necessities, their breaths forming clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. For Eleanor, the harsh season brought unexpected blessings. The enforced isolation meant fewer patients traveling to town, giving Dr. Miller more time to focus on her training. Each morning, they spent 2 hours on medical instruction before opening the office. Anatomy lessons using detailed illustrations. From his medical texts, diagnostic techniques practiced on each other, and the properties of various herbs and medicines catalogued and memorized, Eleanor absorbed it all with fierce determination. Her Boston education had given her an excellent foundation, and her years of teaching had honed her memory. More surprising was how her illness, the very thing that had marked her as unsuitable to Walter Hammond, now gave her unique insight into patient suffering. "You understand pain from the inside," James remarked one evening as they reviewed her diagnosis of Mrs. Peterson's rheumatism. "It makes you more perceptive than most physicians who've never experienced serious illness themselves." Eleanor had never considered her consumption an advantage before. The thought was strangely liberating. On this particular morning, with snow falling in thick curtains outside the frost-etched windows, they were studying the human circulatory system. James had drawn a diagram on the chalkboard they'd salvaged from the abandoned schoolhouse, his artistic skill surprising Eleanor yet again. The heart pumps blood through the arteries, which gradually branch into smaller vessels called arterioles, then into capillaries, he explained, chalk tapping the drawing. Oxygen and nutrients pass through the capillary walls to nourish the tissues, while waste products are collected for removal. Eleanor jotted notes in her precise handwriting. "And the blood returns through the veins to the heart." Exactly. Now, what happens when circulation is restricted? He watched her intently, his teaching style always pushing her to reason through problems rather than memorize facts. "Tissue death eventually," she replied. "First numbness, then pain, then permanent damage if circulation isn't restored." "Which is why frostbite is so common here," James nodded. "When extremities freeze," a pounding on the front door interrupted them. James set down the chalk and strode to answer it, Eleanor following close behind. Sheriff Marcus Wilson stood on the threshold, snow dusting his broad shoulders and hat. His normally stoic face was creased with worry. "Doc, there's been an accident at the Hammond farm. Wagon overturned on the North Ridge. Walter's trapped underneath, and his hired man says it doesn't look good." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten at Hammond's name. Since her arrival 2 months ago, she had successfully avoided any encounter with the man who had rejected her so summarily. James was already grabbing his medical bag. "How long ago?" "Hired hand rode in just now. Took him almost an hour through. The snow." "Damn," James muttered. "Eleanor, I'll need your assistance. This sounds like a multiple-person job." She hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding. Personal feelings had no place in medical emergencies. "I'll pack extra bandages and the splint materials." 10 minutes later, they were in the sheriff's sturdy sleigh, wrapped in every available blanket as his powerful horses broke trail through the deep snow. The journey that normally took an hour stretched to nearly 2 as they battled drifts and poor visibility. Hammond was hauling supplies back from Carson's mill, Sheriff Wilson explained, over the wind's howl. Apparently the wagons slid on ice coming down the ridge trail. His man Jenkins was thrown clear, but Walter got pinned under the wagon when it rolled. James nodded grimly. "Crash injuries are serious business, especially in this cold. How long has he been trapped?" "It's been 3 hours now." Eleanor exchanged a look with James. They both knew what that meant. The risk of shock, hypothermia, and potentially fatal compression injuries increased with every passing minute. The Hammond farm came into view, a substantial 2-story house with outbuildings arranged in a protective square against the elements. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lanterns glowed in the windows. As they approached the North Ridge beyond the main buildings, Eleanor could make out the dark shape of an overturned wagon, and several men working around it. Jenkins, a wiry man with a weathered face, rushed toward them as they pulled up. "Doc, thank God. We've been trying to rig something to lift the wagon, but we're afraid of shifting it wrong and crushing him further." James was already wading through the snow, a medical bag held high. "Show me exactly where he's pinned." Eleanor followed, mentally reviewing what she knew about crush injuries. The wagon had overturned completely, its bed resting at an angle that had left a small space where Walter Hammond was trapped from the waist down. His upper body was visible, face ashen with pain and cold, despite the blankets the men had managed to tuck around him. His eyes widened when he saw her. "What the hell is she doing here?" he rasped, voice weak but still carrying his characteristic disdain. "Saving your life, if you'll allow it," James replied without breaking stride. He knelt in the snow beside Hammond, already assessing his condition. "Miss Pierce is my medical assistant now, and you're in no position to be particular about who treats you." Hammond's retort was lost in a groan of pain as James examined him, feeling for pulse and checking his trapped legs as best he could through the narrow opening. "We need to lift this wagon immediately," he announced, turning to the gathered men. "He's losing circulation to his lower extremities. Much longer and we risk amputation or worse." Under James's direction, they assembled a crude lifting system using fence rails as levers and rocks as fulcrums. Eleanor prepared bandages and medications, then knelt by Hammond's head to monitor his condition while they worked. "Didn't think you'd still be here," Hammond muttered, his face grey with shock. "Figured you'd have gone back east by now." "I found my place," Eleanor replied simply, checking his pulse. It was rapid and there were dangerous signs. "With the doc." His laugh was little more than a wheeze. "Should have known. Too delicate for farm work, perfect for a man who doesn't need real strength in a woman." Eleanor might have been stung by these words months ago. Now she merely adjusted his blanket. "Dr. Miller needs precision, intelligence, and compassion in his assistant, qualities you apparently didn't value." Hammond's eyes narrowed, but whatever he might have said was cut off by James's shout. "Ready! On my count. 1, 2, 3. The men strained against the levers, muscles cording as they fought gravity and the wagon's weight. Wood creaked, metal groaned, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the wagon lifted. As soon as there was space, Eleanor and James moved in to drag Hammond clear. What they found beneath the wagon made Eleanor's stomach clench. Hammond's legs were badly crushed, blood staining the snow beneath him. One thigh showed the unmistakable deformity of a compound fracture, bone gleaming white against torn flesh. James worked with swift efficiency, applying tourniquets to stem the bleeding, while Eleanor prepared morphine for the pain. Hammond had mercifully lost consciousness during the extraction, which made their initial treatment easier. "We need to get him to the office," James said grimly. "These injuries are beyond field treatment." The journey back to town was tense, Hammond's life hanging by a thread as the sleigh jostled through drifts. Eleanor kept constant watch on his vitals, administering small doses of brandy when his pulse weakened alarmingly. By the time they reached the doctor's office, darkness had fallen. Sheriff Wilson and Jenkins carried Hammond inside, while James and Eleanor rapidly prepared the examination room for surgery. "His right leg is beyond saving," James said quietly as they worked. "The left might be salvageable, but infection is a significant risk." Eleanor nodded, laying out the surgical instruments. "Should I fetch Sarah Blackwood to assist? This will be difficult with just the two of us." "Good thinking. We'll need someone to administer chloroform while we work." The next hours passed in a blur of focused intensity. Sarah arrived quickly, her experienced hands steady as she maintained Hammond's unconsciousness while James performed the amputation of the right leg. Eleanor assisted with instruments and sutures. Her earlier training with Matthew Doyle now expanded to a far more complex procedure. The left leg required extensive debridement and careful reconstruction. Bones set and shattered blood vessels, painstakingly tied off. Dawn was breaking by the time they finished, all three exhausted but satisfied that they had done everything possible. "He'll live," James pronounced, washing blood from his hands. Whether he'll thank us for it remains to be seen. A one-legged farmer faces significant challenges. He has money for hired help, Sarah observed, wiping down surfaces with carbolic solution, and that big house sits empty except for him. Prideful fool. Eleanor said nothing, changing Hammond's bandages one final time before they moved him to the recovery room. The man who had deemed her too weak for frontier life now lay broken and dependent on others for his most basic needs. There was no satisfaction in the irony, only a weary recognition of life's unpredictable turns. Later, as James and Eleanor sat by the office stove drinking coffee laced with whiskey to warm their chilled bodies, he studied her with newfound respect. "You performed admirably today," he said. "Most trained physicians would have balked at what you helped accomplish." Eleanor shook her head, too tired for false modesty. "I did what was necessary, as did you." Not everyone could set aside personal feelings to help someone who treated them poorly. That's what healing means, isn't it? She met his gaze steadily, seeing beyond the surface to what truly matters. James's expression softened. "You would have made an exceptional physician, Eleanor." The use of her first name, unprecedented, until now, hung in the air between them, intimate as a touch. She didn't correct him or revert to formality. "I still might," she replied softly, allowing herself a rare moment of hope. "My Boston doctor gave me 6 months. It's been 5, and I'm stronger now than when I arrived." James reached across the small table, his hand covering hers briefly. "Medicine isn't always about curing. Sometimes it's about creating possibilities where none existed before." Outside, the snow had stopped, and weak winter sunshine glinted on the crystalline world. Stillwater Creek was beginning to stir to life, unaware that the night had changed multiple destinies within its boundaries, most of all, the unexpected bond forming between a rejected mail-order bride and the doctor who had recognized her true worth. January brought with it a strange calm to Stillwater Creek. The fierce storms of December gave way to a steady, cold stillness where breath froze mid-air and the world seemed suspended in crystal silence. For the residents, it was a time of indoor pursuits, mending harnesses, quilting blankets, and telling long stories around hearthfires while waiting for spring's distant promise. For Eleanor, it was a time of unexpected transformation. The demands of Walter Hammond's care had accelerated her medical training beyond what months of regular study could have achieved. The man remained in the doctor's recovery room, unable to be moved back to his farm until the worst of winter passed and his condition stabilized. His presence created a peculiar dynamic in the small medical practice. By day, Eleanor changed his bandages, monitored his healing wounds, and administered medications with professional detachment. By night, she and James discussed his case as equals, the doctor increasingly deferring to her observations about Hammond's progress. "The stump is healing well," she reported one evening as they sat in James's quarters reviewing patient notes. "No signs of infection, though he complains of phantom sensations in the missing foot." James nodded, making notations in the file. "That's to be expected. The brain remembers what the body has lost." He glanced up at her. "How are you managing? With him personally, he's not the easiest patient." Eleanor smiled faintly. "He alternates between sullen silence and backhanded compliments about how surprisingly capable I am, despite my unfortunate constitution." "A vast improvement over his initial attitude," James observed dryly. "Perhaps nearly dying has granted him a modicum of perspective, or perhaps he simply has no choice but to accept my care." Eleanor sipped her tea, considering. "It's strange. He still sees me as fundamentally flawed, yet relies completely on my supposedly flawed hands to tend his wounds." James set down his pen, studying her thoughtfully. People rarely recognize the strength that exists alongside vulnerability. It's why so many here distrust illness. They see only weakness, not the resilience it often creates. His words resonated deeply with Eleanor. Her entire life had been shaped by others' perceptions of her physical limitations, from her father's overprotectiveness to Walter Hammond's rejection. Only here, in this frontier doctor's office, had anyone looked beyond her fragile appearance to see her capabilities. "You saw it," she said quietly. "From the beginning." James's expression softened. "I've spent my life reading bodies for signs. Others miss. Yours spoke of determination long before you ever picked up a medical text. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that transcended their professional relationship without quite naming what had begun to take its place." Eleanor looked away first, returning to Hammond's file with a composure that belied her quickened pulse. "His hired man, Jenkins, has been by twice this week," she noted, changing the subject. "Apparently the farm is struggling without Hammond's oversight. Not surprising. A frontier operation that size requires constant management." James frowned. "Hammond will need to consider his options. Even with a prosthesis, he won't manage the physical demands of before." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the practice. Eleanor was organizing medicine bottles when the door opened, admitting a swirl of snow and a tall, elegantly dressed woman who surveyed the modest waiting room with obvious distaste. "I'm looking for Walter Hammond," she announced without preamble, her Boston accent immediately identifying her as an Easterner. "I was told he's being treated here." Eleanor straightened, taking in the visitor's expensive fur-trimmed coat and fashionable hat. "Mr. Hammond is recovering from surgery and sees visitors only at specific hours. May I ask your name?" The woman's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Victoria Harrington, his sister." She assessed Eleanor with cool appraisal. "And you would be?" "Eleanor Pierce, Dr. Miller's medical assistant." She met the woman's gaze steadily. "Mr. Hammond is resting now, but I can inform him of your arrival when he wakes." Victoria Harrington removed her gloves deliberately, revealing fingers adorned with several expensive rings. "That won't be necessary. Family requires no announcement." She moved toward the recovery room door with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. Eleanor stepped smoothly into her path. "I'm afraid I must insist, Mrs. Harrington. Your brother has undergone traumatic surgery, and his recovery depends on strict medical protocols. Dr. Miller is currently out on a house call, but he would give you the same instructions." For a moment, the two women faced each other in silent opposition, Victoria clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, Eleanor unwilling to compromise her patient's care, regardless of who demanded it. Finally, Victoria's lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "Well, it seems my brother has found himself under quite particular care." She removed her hat, revealing elaborately styled dark hair streaked with elegant silver. "I'll wait for Dr. Miller then. Perhaps he can explain why Walter's urgent telegram took 3 weeks to reach me in Boston." Eleanor gestured to the waiting area. "Winter mail service to the territory is unreliable at best. Please make yourself comfortable. Can I offer you tea while you wait?" As she prepared the tea, Eleanor's mind raced. Hammond had never mentioned a sister, let alone one wealthy enough to make the difficult winter journey from Boston on short notice. Her presence complicated an already delicate situation. James returned an hour later, stomping snow from his boots as he entered. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Victoria Harrington perched on the office's best chair like a queen holding court. "Dr. Miller," Eleanor said formally, "this is Mrs. Victoria Harrington, Mr. Hammond's sister from Boston. She's come in response to his telegram." James absorbed this information with his characteristic calm. "Mrs. Harrington, welcome to Stillwater Creek. I'm afraid your journey comes at a difficult time for your brother. Victoria waved an impatient hand. So, I gather, your assistant has been quite insistent on protocols. Perhaps you could be more forthcoming about Walter's condition. James glanced at Eleanor with approval before addressing Victoria. Your brother suffered crushing injuries when his wagon overturned. We were forced to amputate his right leg above the knee. The left leg was severely damaged but saved. He faces a long recovery and will require assistance for the foreseeable future. Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly, genuine concern flashing across her features. How permanent are these limitations? He will never farm again as he once did, James said bluntly. With a proper prosthesis and time, he can regain mobility, but the physical demands of frontier agriculture are beyond what his body will tolerate. The news seemed to age Victoria visibly. She set down her teacup with a hand that trembled slightly. I see. Then I've arrived just in time. She straightened her shoulders. I intend to take Walter back to Boston as soon as he's able to travel. Eleanor and James exchanged surprised glances. That's a decision for Mr. Hammond to make, Eleanor noted carefully. Victoria's laugh held little humor. My brother is stubborn to the point of self-destruction, Miss Pierce. He fled to this wilderness after his fiancée jilted him, determined to prove he didn't need Boston society. Now that his frontier experiment has nearly killed him, it's time. He returned to civilization and proper medical care. The care he's receiving here is entirely appropriate for his condition, James said, a hint of steel entering his voice. And the decision to relocate during recovery carries significant risks. Regardless, I wish to see him now. Victoria stood, brooking no further delay. James nodded. Of course. Miss Pierce will take you to him while I prepare some information about his condition you should know. Eleanor led Victoria to the recovery room, where Hammond lay sleeping, his face lined with pain even in repose. The stump of his right leg was clearly outlined beneath the blanket, while the left was elevated on pillows, encased in a complex splint. Of James's design, Victoria's composure faltered at the sight. "Oh, Walter," she whispered, suddenly looking less like a Boston society matron and more like a worried sister. Eleanor discreetly withdrew to give them privacy, rejoining James in the office. "This complicates matters," she murmured. "Indeed." James rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Hammond could receive excellent specialist care in Boston, but the journey itself might kill him in his current state, not to mention his mental state, returning east as a failure after his grand frontier ambitions. Eleanor shook her head. His pride may suffer more damage than his body already has. Their conversation was interrupted when Victoria emerged. From the recovery room, her expression troubled. "My brother is awake now, Doctor. He's asking for you, and Miss Pierce as well." They found Hammond propped against his pillows, face flushed with fever or emotion. "Victoria wants to drag me back to Boston," he said without preamble. "To hire specialists and nurses and turn me into an invalid for society to whisper about." "You need proper care, Walter," his sister insisted. "Care that goes beyond what's available in this settlement." Hammond's laugh was bitter, like the proper care that killed Eliza Carrington when Boston's finest physicians attended her childbed. He turned to James and Eleanor. Tell her what you two accomplished with limited supplies in frontier surgery during a blizzard." James stepped forward. "Mr. Hammond's injuries were severe, Mrs. Harrington, but his treatment has been comprehensive. The amputation was clean, infection has been prevented, and the salvaged leg is healing better than expected." "Thanks to her," Hammond added, nodding toward Eleanor with grudging respect. "The woman I rejected as too sickly for frontier life saved mine. There's a particular humility in having your bandages changed by someone you once dismissed as worthless." Eleanor maintained her professional expression, though his words stirred complex emotions. "Your recovery is still in its early stages, Mr. Hammond. Your sister's concern is understandable." Victoria looked between them, clearly reassessing the dynamics she had walked into. "I see you've developed confidence in your care here, Walter. But surely you understand that your life has fundamentally changed." "The farm will be sold," Hammond interrupted. "Jenkins has already found a buyer. The Anderson family wants to expand. I won't return to Boston as a failure, Victoria. I'll return when I'm ready, with resources to establish myself on my own terms." The tension in the room was palpable as brother and sister engaged in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Victoria sighed. "At least allow me to stay and assist with your recovery. I've come all this way, after all." Hammond glanced at James. "Is there room for my sister at the boarding house?" "Mrs. Winters always has space in winter." James: "Confirmed. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Harrington, that frontier accommodations may not meet your expectations." Victoria straightened her spine. "I survived finishing school dormitories, Doctor. I expect I can manage a boarding house for the sake of family duty." As Eleanor showed Victoria out to arrange her lodging, the woman paused at the door. "You were to be Walter's mail-order bride, weren't you?" she asked abruptly. "The one he mentioned in his letters, too delicate for his requirements." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Yes." Victoria studied her with new interest. "How peculiar that fate should bring you together this way. You are tending the wounds of the man who rejected you. Life rarely follows the paths we anticipate." "Mrs. Harrington?" Eleanor replied simply. "Indeed." Victoria's lips curved in a genuine smile for the first time. "Perhaps especially on the frontier. I believe my stay in Stillwater Creek will be more enlightening than I expected." As Victoria departed into the snow, Eleanor couldn't help wondering how this new presence from the east would alter the delicate balance they had established, and what it might mean for her own uncertain future. February, in Stillwater Creek, brought brief, deceptive thaws that turned the streets to sucking mud before freezing again into treacherous ridges and hollows. The residents called it Liar's Spring, when nature hinted at renewal only to snatch it away with renewed fury. Victoria Harrington had adapted to frontier life with surprising resilience. Though she maintained her Boston manners and continued to dress with more formality than the situation warranted, she had integrated herself into the town's rhythms with determined grace. Mrs. Winters had initially viewed her wealthy lodger with suspicion, but Victoria's willingness to help with chores and her generous payment for accommodations had softened the widow's stance. Most unexpected was Victoria's growing involvement in her brother's medical care. After observing Eleanor's treatments for several days, she had requested instruction in basic wound cleaning and dressing changes, proving herself a quick study despite her initial squeamishness. "You have unexpected aptitude for this," Eleanor remarked one morning as they changed Hammond's bandages together. "Many well-bred ladies would faint at the sight of such wounds." Victoria secured the fresh bandage with practiced hands. "Breeding has little to do with practical skills, Miss Pierce. My husband died of cancer 3 years ago. I learned much about nursing during his decline. It was the first personal information." Victoria had volunteered, and Eleanor recognized the significance of the confidence. "I'm sorry for your loss. As am I for whatever circumstances brought you west as a mail-order bride," Victoria replied, her directness matching Eleanor's. "Though perhaps we both should consider what those losses led us toward, rather than what they took away. Their tentative friendship had formed a bridge between the frontier and eastern worlds that Eleanor had thought irreconcilably separate. Victoria brought news of medical advancements, cultural developments, and social changes that reconnected Eleanor to the life she had left behind. In return, Eleanor shared the harsh wisdom of frontier survival and the unexpected depth of community that existed beneath Stillwater Creek's rough exterior. This morning, they were interrupted in their work by Sarah Blackwood's arrival at the practice. The midwife's face was creased with concern. "There's trouble at the Blackfoot camp," she announced without preamble. "Fevers spread through their winter quarters. They've lost 3 children already and more are sick." James looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Measles," Sarah nodded grimly. "Looks that way. Trading party brought it back from Fort Benton last month. Their medicine man sent a rider asking for your help." Victoria looked alarmed. "Surely you're not considering going? The Blackfoot are still hostile in parts of the territory." "Not this band," James replied, already gathering supplies. "Chief Running Elk and I have an understanding. His people have helped me more than once when I've been caught in storms on my circuit." "Even so," Victoria persisted, "measles is highly contagious. You'd be putting yourself at considerable risk." James continued packing his medical bag. "Risk is part of frontier medicine, Mrs. Harrington. I can't refuse help to children dying of a disease we can at least manage, if not cure." Eleanor had already begun collecting additional supplies: willow bark for fever, honey for coughs, and clean clothes for cooling baths. "How many children are affected?" she asked Sarah. "At least 15 showing symptoms, maybe more by now. The camp has nearly 100 people total." James glanced at Eleanor, understanding passing between them before he spoke. "I'll need assistance. This is more than I can handle alone." "I'll come with you," Eleanor said without hesitation, though she knew the journey and exposure would tax her fragile lungs. Victoria looked between them with a dawning comprehension of what remained unspoken. "You can't possibly mean to take Miss Pierce into a disease-ridden camp. In her condition, I've had measles as a child," Eleanor interrupted calmly. "I'm not at risk for infection, and Dr. Miller needs skilled assistance, not just an extra pair of hands." "It's a 3-day ride in good weather," Sarah added, concern evident in her voice. "And the forecast isn't promising." James finished packing medicines, his movements deliberate as he considered. "The decision is Eleanor's to make. She understands the risks better than anyone." The use of her first name in front of others marked a shift, an acknowledgement of their relationship as more than merely professional. Victoria noticed it immediately, her gaze sharpening as she observed them with new insight. "Walter needs continued care," Eleanor noted, practical despite her determination. "We can't leave him without medical supervision." "I can manage my brother's basic needs," Victoria offered unexpectedly. "Mrs. Blackwood can oversee anything more complex until you return." Sarah raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "I've treated worse than an amputated limb in my time." Hammond himself provided the final word when informed of the situation. "Go," he told Eleanor from his recovery bed. "If anyone questions your strength after you've ridden into Blackfoot territory in February to treat measles, I'll personally set them straight." By midday, Eleanor and James were mounted on the practice's 2 sturdiest horses, laden with medical supplies and winter gear. Sarah had provided detailed directions to the Blackfoot winter camp, nestled in a sheltered valley 15 miles north of Stillwater Creek. "We should reach Miller's Crossing by nightfall," James said, as they rode out of town, referring to the small trading post halfway to their destination. "We can shelter there and continue at first light." Eleanor nodded, already feeling the cold seep through her layers, despite the fur-lined coat James had insisted she wear. Her breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the winter air, and she focused on the steady rhythm of her horse's hooves rather than the tightness gathering in her chest. They rode in companionable silence for the first few miles, each lost in preparation for what awaited them. The landscape stretched before them in pristine white, broken occasionally by stands of pine or rocky outcroppings. In another season, Eleanor might have found it beautiful. Now she recognized it as both majestic and deadly, unforgiving to those who failed to respect its power. "Tell me about the Blackfoot," she said finally, as much to distract herself from the cold as from genuine curiosity. "How did you establish trust with them?" James adjusted his scarf against the wind before answering. "My second year in the territory, I treated a Blackfoot boy for a rattlesnake bite when his family was traveling near town. The treatment worked and word spread. Later, when influenza hit their camp, their medicine man requested my help. And you went? Alone?" "Fear breeds more misunderstanding than anything else out here," he replied simply. "They needed help. I could provide it. The rest was a matter of showing respect for their ways while offering what knowledge I had." Eleanor considered this. "The Boston papers portray all natives as savages beyond reasoning." "People fear what they don't understand," James said. "The Blackfoot have a complex society with different values than ours, but they love their children and mourn their dead just as deeply as any Bostonian." As they created a ridge, the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of a coming storm. James studied the sky with concern, noting the heavy grey clouds building to the northwest. "Weather's turning faster than I hoped," he observed. "We should quicken our pace if we want to reach shelter before it hits." They urged their horses to a faster trot, the animals sensing the approaching storm as keenly as their riders. Eleanor felt her lungs labor with the increased exertion and colder air, but said nothing. The children waiting at the Blackfoot camp had greater concerns than her discomfort. An hour later, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle drift of a normal winter day, but the thick, swirling harbingers of a serious blizzard. Visibility decreased rapidly as wind whipped the snow into blinding sheets. "There's a trapper's cabin about a mile ahead," James called over the rising howl. "We need to shelter now. Miller's Crossing is still hours away." Eleanor nodded, too breathless to respond verbally. The cold had settled deep in her chest, each inhaling a struggle against constricting airways. She focused on staying upright in the saddle, following James's lead as he navigated through increasingly difficult conditions. The cabin appeared suddenly through the whiteout, a low, dark shape almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rocks. James dismounted quickly, leading both horses to the minimal shelter of an overhanging cliff, while Eleanor slid from her saddle, legs nearly buckling as they touched ground. "It hasn't been used this season," James noted as he forced the frozen door open. "But it's solid enough to wait out the storm." The interior was Spartan. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank floor, and the skeletal frame of a bed without bedding. Eleanor sank onto a wooden stool, fighting for breath, while James quickly gathered the fire-starting materials. The trapper had left behind. "Your breathing is labored," he observed, his physician's eyes missing nothing despite his focus on getting a fire lit. "It will pass," she managed, unlacing her coat with trembling fingers. "Once we're warm." James said nothing more until the fire caught, filling the tiny cabin with blessed light and growing warmth. Then he knelt before her, taking her wrist to check her pulse. Rapid and thready, he noted clinically, though his eyes held more than professional concern. "Eleanor, this journey may be beyond what your body can safely manage." She met his gaze steadily despite her difficulty breathing. "We both knew that possibility when we left town. Knowing abstractly and seeing you struggle are different matters." His hand remained on her wrist, thumb absently stroking across her pulse point in a gesture that transcended medical examination. "The children need help," she said simply. "This discomfort is temporary. I've weathered worse." James's expression softened, professional distance giving way to something deeper and more personal. "You are the most stubborn patient I've ever treated. Fortunate that I'm also your assistant then," she replied with a faint smile. "You need someone equally stubborn to match your own tendencies towards self-sacrifice." He laughed softly, the sound warming the space between them more effectively than the fire. "A fair assessment." Outside, the storm intensified, snow and wind, combining into a howling fury that shook the cabin's sturdy walls. Trapped together in this small shelter, miles from town and surrounded by wilderness, the careful boundaries they had maintained began to shift like the drifting snow outside. "We may be here through the night," James said, moving to unpack their saddlebags. "The Blackfoot children will have to wait until the storm passes." Eleanor nodded, accepting the practical reality. "Then we should use this time to prepare. The more organized our supplies, the more efficient we'll be when we reach the camp." As they sorted medicines by firelight, the storm raging around their fragile shelter, both recognized that something fundamental had changed between them, a shift as inevitable as the seasons and as natural as breath, even when that breath came with difficulty. Dawn came reluctantly to the trapper's cabin, pale light filtering through the single frost-covered window. The storm had spent its fury sometime in the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of sculpted drifts and pristine white. Eleanor woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. She was wrapped in James's heavy coat as well as her own, propped against the wall near the now smouldering fire. Across the small space, James sat on the rough-hewn floor, back against the door, head tilted at an uncomfortable angle as he slept. He had insisted she take the stool, the closest thing to a proper seat in the sparse cabin, while he maintained the fire through the night. She remembered drifting off to the rhythmic sound of him feeding small logs into the flames, his deep voice reciting medical texts from memory to keep them both focused on something beyond the howling wind. Her chest felt tight but not unbearable, a victory considering the circumstances. She shifted slightly, and James's eyes opened immediately, the alertness of a frontier doctor who slept lightly out of necessity. "Good morning," she said, her voice rasping slightly. "The storm has passed." James straightened, rolling his shoulders, to release the stiffness of his uncomfortable position. "How's your breathing?" "Manageable," she replied honestly. She had learned early in their relationship that half-truths about her condition helped neither of them. "The warmth helped considerably," he nodded, rising to check the window. "The drifts are deep. Travel will be slow, but possible, if we leave. Within the hour, we should reach the Blackfoot camp by midday." They prepared quickly, sharing the last of the jerky and dried apples from their provisions. James rebuilt the fire before they left, a courtesy to the next traveler who might need emergency shelter. Outside, the cold hit Eleanor's lungs like a physical blow, but she mounted her horse without complaint. Their progress was indeed slow, the animals laboring through knee-deep snow as they followed a trail only James could discern in the altered landscape. Mid-morning brought them to higher ground where they could see across the valley below. There, nestled against a sheltered ridge, stood a cluster of structures, some traditional hide-covered teepees, others more permanent wooden lodges built for winter use. "The Blackfoot Winter Camp," James explained, pointing. "Chief Running Elk's band stays in this valley from first snow until spring hunting season. It's protected from the worst winds and has a hot spring that keeps part of the stream from freezing." Thin columns of smoke rose from several lodges, but the usual activity of a thriving camp was noticeably absent. No children played in the snow, no women gathered at the central fire. The stillness spoke volumes about the severity of the situation. As they approached, a tall figure emerged from the largest lodge. The man wore traditional buckskins beneath a wool trade blanket, his long hair parted in the center and braided with eagle feathers. His face was deeply lined yet powerful, with eyes that held both wisdom and wariness. "Chief Running Elk," James greeted him, dismounting and approaching with his right hand raised, palm forward in the gesture of peace Eleanor had seen him use. "With other tribal members." The chief returned the gesture, his expression easing slightly. "Healer who rides far," he replied in accented but clear English. "2 more children died in the night, many others burn with fever." James nodded gravely. "I've brought medicines that may help, and my assistant." He gestured to Eleanor, who had dismounted more slowly, still catching her breath from the journey. "She is skilled in healing and has survived this sickness herself." Running Elk studied Eleanor with penetrating intensity, his gaze noting her fine-boned features and the careful way she measured her breathing. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, a brief softening of his stern countenance. "The small ones who survive become the strongest," he said, gesturing for them to follow him into the main lodge. Inside, the difference between appearance and reality struck Eleanor immediately. What looked primitive from outside was, in fact, a well-designed winter dwelling, spacious, warm, and surprisingly well ventilated through a sophisticated chimney system. Central fires provided heat without smoke, while raised platforms lined with furs served as beds. On these platforms lay the sick, mostly children ranging from infants to young teenagers, their skin marked with the characteristic rash of measles, their eyes bright with fever. Women moved quietly among them, applying cool cloths and offering sips of water. 22 sick, Running Elk said simply. 3 died yesterday, 2 more in darkness hours. James immediately began examining the nearest child, his movements gentle yet efficient. Classic measles presentation, severe in some cases. "Eleanor will need to identify the most critical patients first." They worked methodically, Eleanor recording symptoms and severity as James assessed each child. Her medical training now proved its value beyond measure as she recognized complications. Pneumonia developing in the younger ones, dangerous dehydration in others. What struck her most powerfully was how the Blackfoot mothers watched them. Not with the superstitious fear she had been taught to expect from savages, but with the universal concern of parents for their suffering children. In their eyes, she saw the same emotions she had witnessed countless times in Boston schoolrooms when illness swept through. Hope, fear, determination, love. By midday, they had established a treatment protocol. James prepared willow bark and mint infusions for fever while Eleanor organized the mothers into shifts for applying cool compresses and ensuring the children drank enough liquid. Their medicine man had already started similar treatments, James explained as they worked. "He's incorporating our medicines with his traditional remedies. It's a partnership, not a replacement." Indeed, the tribal healer, a weathered man with keen, intelligent eyes, worked alongside them without resistance, adding his knowledge of local herbs to their Western medicines. Through Running Elk's translation, he explained treatments that had helped previous generations survive outbreaks brought by white traders. He says steam from pine needles boiled in water helps the breathing, Running Elk interpreted, and bearberry tea strengthens the body's fight. James nodded respectfully. Both excellent additions. The pine steam will help clear congested lungs, and bearberry has properties that support recovery. As afternoon turned to evening, Eleanor found herself working alongside a young Blackfoot mother whose twins, a boy and girl of about 4, were among the most severely affected. The woman spoke no English, but they communicated through gestures and expressions, united by their focus on the children's care. When one twin's fever spiked dangerously high, Eleanor demonstrated how to wrap the child in clothes soaked in cool water, then held the mother's hand as they waited anxiously for the temperature to fall. When it finally did, the woman gripped Eleanor's fingers tightly, their shared relief transcending any cultural divide. "Her name is Morning Sky," Running Elk said, appearing beside them. "She asks why you risk sickness to help her children." Eleanor considered carefully before answering, aware of cultural differences in how illness was viewed. "Because all children deserve healing hands, no matter where they're born. And because I understand what it means to fight against a body that betrays you." Running Elk translated for Morning Sky, whose eyes filled with tears. She spoke rapidly, touching her chest in a gesture Eleanor recognized from her own experience with lung troubles. "She says you carry the coughing sickness," Running Elk translated. Yet you ride through snow to help strangers. Not strangers. Any more, Eleanor replied simply. As darkness fell, the lodge was transformed by firelight into a space of strange beauty. Shadows dancing across animal-hide walls, children sleeping more peacefully as treatments began to take effect, mothers singing soft lullabies in a language Eleanor couldn't understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. James found her sitting beside the twins, refreshing the cool cloth on the boy's forehead, while his sister slept more comfortably nearby. "You should rest," he said quietly, kneeling beside her. "You've been working non-stop since we arrived." Eleanor shook her head. "I promised Morning Sky I'd watch them while she gets some sleep. She's been awake for 3 days." James studied her. Face in the firelight, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the pallor accentuated by exhaustion, but also the quiet determination that had first drawn him to her. "When I suggested you accompany me," he said softly, "I never imagined you'd give so much of yourself. Didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "I think you saw something in me from the beginning that others missed, including myself." He didn't deny it. Instead, he settled beside her, their shoulders touching lightly as they maintained their vigil over the sleeping children. "The worst cases are stabilizing," he reported. "No new deaths since we arrived. I believe we're turning the corner." Morning. Sky said their medicine man had a vision that help would come on the eagle's wings, Eleanor murmured. "I wonder what he would think if he knew it was a rejected mail-order bride and a frontier doctor who answered his call." "I suspect he would say that the Great Spirit works through unexpected vessels," James replied. His hand found hers in the U, shadows between them, fingers intertwining naturally. "As I have discovered myself." They sat in companionable silence, the contact of their hands saying more than words could express. Around them, the Blackfoot camp continued its night rhythms. Mothers checking feverish children, medicine man chanting healing prayers, guards watching the perimeter against nocturnal predators. Eleanor felt a strange peace descend, despite her exhaustion and the persistent tightness in her chest. Here, hundreds of miles from the Boston society that had defined success in such limited terms, she had found purpose that transcended her physical limitations and a connection that defied conventional understanding. "James," she said softly, using his first name deliberately, "I don't regret coming west anymore, even knowing how it began with rejection." His fingers tightened around hers. "Perhaps especially because of how it began," he suggested. "Some journeys only find their true purpose through detours we never intended to take." As the fire cast dancing shadows across lodge walls, adorned with painted symbols of healing and protection, Eleanor understood that her life's path had never been about finding a husband or securing conventional stability. It had been leading her here, to this moment of connection across seemingly insurmountable divides, to this unexpected belonging among those who recognized strength could exist alongside frailty. Morning Sky returned, rested enough to resume her watch, and smiled at their linked hands before taking her place beside the twins. No translation was needed for the knowing glance she exchanged with Eleanor. Some understandings transcended language and culture alike. April brought the first true stirrings of spring to Stillwater Creek. The snow retreated to shadowed ravines and north-facing slopes, while green shoots pushed defiantly through the softening earth. Birdsong returned to the awakening forests, and the creek that gave the town its name swelled with snowmelt, its waters running clear and swift over stone. 2 months had passed since Eleanor and James returned from the Blackfoot camp, bringing with them more than just the satisfaction of averting a crisis. They had saved 19 of the 22 children, a triumph that rippled through both communities. Chief Running Elk had proclaimed them heartkin to the Blackfoot, an honorary relationship that carried significance beyond mere words. The experience had transformed Eleanor in ways both subtle and profound. The harsh journey had indeed taxed her weakened lungs, leaving her bedridden with fever for nearly a week after their return. Yet rather than deteriorating as the Boston doctor had predicted, she had gradually rallied, each day bringing slightly easier breath than the one before. "It defies conventional medical understanding," James admitted one evening as he listened to her lungs, the stethoscope revealing improvement where decline had been expected. "By all accounts, that journey should have accelerated your condition." "Perhaps conventional understanding doesn't account for purpose," Eleanor suggested, watching spring rain trace patterns down the window of the examination room, "or for finding one's proper place in the world." Now, on this bright April morning, Eleanor stood on the small balcony outside her apartment, surveying Stillwater Creek as it bustled with the energy of renewal. The town had changed during her 6 months of residence, or perhaps it was her perception that had shifted. What had initially seemed a crude outpost on the edge of civilization now revealed itself as a community of surprising complexity and resilience. The door below opened, and Victoria Harrington emerged, dressed for travel in a practical riding outfit that would have scandalized Boston society. The transformation in Walter Hammond's sister was perhaps the most unexpected development of the winter. After initially planning a brief stay to oversee her brother's early recovery, Victoria had gradually integrated herself into frontier life with remarkable adaptability. "Good morning, Eleanor," she called up, shading her eyes against the bright spring sunshine. "Are you ready for our adventure?" Eleanor smiled. "Just finishing my preparations. I'll be down momentarily." Inside her apartment, she checked her medical bag one final time, a gift from James when she had officially progressed from assistant to apprentice 3 weeks earlier. It contained the essential tools of frontier medicine: stethoscope, bandages, tinctures she had prepared herself, and the journal where she recorded treatments and outcomes with meticulous care. Today marked a significant step in her evolution. She and Victoria were riding to the newly established Hammond Convalescent Home, Walter's ambitious project born from his life-altering injury. Using proceeds from his farm sale and Victoria's considerable investment, he had converted his former residence into a recovery facility for those requiring extended care after illness or injury. "A place where weakness can become strength," he had explained with uncharacteristic humility when proposing the venture, "where those deemed too fragile might find their own path to recovery." The irony was lost on no one that the man who had once rejected Eleanor as too sickly now sought her medical expertise for his patients. Walter himself had changed profoundly during his months of recovery. The bitter pride that had defined him had mellowed into something more reflective, his vulnerability awakening compassion few had suspected he possessed. Eleanor descended the stairs to find James waiting in the office below, reviewing patient files with the focused attention that had first impressed her months ago. "All prepared for your first official consultation?" he asked, looking up with the warm smile he now reserved solely for her. "As prepared as your instruction allows," she replied with gentle teasing, "though I suspect there will be situations no amount of training could anticipate." "The hallmark of frontier medicine," he agreed. "We adapt, improvise, and sometimes simply make our best guess while appearing confident about the outcome." Victoria entered from outside, bringing the fresh scent of spring air with her. "The horses are ready whenever you are, Eleanor. Walter is quite beside himself with anticipation. You'd think the president himself was visiting, rather than his former mail-order bride." The three shared a knowing look, united in their appreciation for how thoroughly circumstances had upended expectations. When Eleanor had arrived in Stillwater Creek last October, broken-hearted and seemingly destined for an early grave, none could have predicted the web of relationships that would form around her supposed weakness. Before you go, James said, reaching into his desk drawer, I have something for you. He withdrew a small leather case, weathered but well made, with Eleanor's initials newly stamped in the corner. She opened it to find a gleaming set of surgical instruments, smaller than standard size, perfectly suited to her hands. James, she breathed, running her fingers over the precision tools. These must have cost. They're from my days at medical college, he interrupted. I had them resized and refurbished in Helena. Every physician should have instruments that feel like extensions of themselves. The word hung in the air between them, physician, not assistant or apprentice. It acknowledged what they had both come to understand over the months of working side by side. Eleanor had found her calling, one that transcended the limitations others had defined for her. Victoria discreetly stepped outside, leaving them a moment of privacy that would have been unthinkable in Boston drawing rooms, but seemed perfectly natural in the context of their frontier existence. The medical college in Denver has responded to my inquiry, James said quietly. They've agreed to consider your application for formal training, with your practical experience counting toward requirements. Eleanor's heart quickened. They had discussed the possibility during long evenings studying together, but having it materialize into opportunity still felt surreal. And if I were to pursue formal training? She asked, the question encompassing far more than medical education. James took her hands, the surgical kit between them, like a shared promise. Then I would count the days until your return, while taking pride in knowing you were fulfilling the potential I saw in you from the beginning. Their courtship had unfolded with the same careful deliberation that characterized their medical practice. Observation, diagnosis, treatment, each step building on the one before. Neither had rushed to name what grew between them, allowing it to develop naturally amid the daily rhythms of their shared work. And what of my condition? She asked, giving voice to the concern that still shadowed their future. Though improved, her lungs remained damaged, her future uncertain. We face it together, he replied simply. Whether we have decades or days, they will be lived with purpose. The honesty of his answer, no false promises, no sugar-coated sentiments, confirmed what Eleanor had recognized during that night in the Blackfoot camp. Here was a man who saw her completely, frailty and strength alike, and valued the whole. Their kiss was brief but profound, sealing an understanding that required no elaborate declarations or social conventions. On the frontier, truth stood unadorned, relationships forged in the crucible of survival rather than the parlors of propriety. Victoria's discreet cough from the doorway signaled it was time to depart. Eleanor gathered her medical bag and the precious new surgical kit, stepping into the spring sunshine with a confidence that had nothing to do with physical robustness and everything to do with knowing her true worth. The ride to the Hammond convalescent home took them through greening meadows where wildflowers had begun their annual explosion of color. Eleanor breathed deeply, noting with quiet satisfaction how her lungs expanded more freely than they had in months. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked as they rode side by side, coming west only to be rejected, nearly dying in the process. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I regret the pain and uncertainty, but not the journey itself." She gestured to the vast landscape surrounding them. "Sometimes we must be uprooted from familiar soil to discover where we truly belong." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I came here determined to rescue my brother from what I perceived as primitive conditions. Instead, I found myself reconsidering what constitutes civilization." She smoothed her riding skirt, a practical garment that would have horrified her Boston peers. "Walter and I have decided to make the convalescent home our permanent venture. The Hammond fortune can do more good here than in Boston society. Another unexpected transplant that took root, Eleanor observed with a smile. They crested a small rise, and the Hammond property came into view. The substantial house now modified with wheelchair ramps and a newly constructed solarium where patients could benefit from sunlight even in inclement weather. Walter himself sat on the wide front porch, his wooden prosthetic leg visible beneath his trouser leg, a ledger open on the table before him. He raised a hand in greeting, the gesture containing none of the dismissive arrogance that had characterized their first meeting. Beside him sat Sarah Blackwood, who had taken an increasing interest in the convalescent project, her practical experience with birth and death making her an invaluable advisor. "Welcome to the beginning of your new chapter," Victoria said as they approached the property, though perhaps it's more accurate to say the continuation of a story that has taken unexpected turns. Eleanor nodded, thinking of the journey that had brought her here. From rejected mail-order bride to respected healer, from dying woman to one who had found reason to live fully whatever time remained to her. Ahead lay further challenges: formal medical training, establishing her professional identity, building a life with James that honored both their individual callings and their shared purpose. Yet, as spring sunshine warmed her face and the expansive Montana sky stretched infinitely above her, Eleanor Pierce knew one truth with absolute certainty: strength could exist alongside frailty, and sometimes what appeared to be our greatest weakness led us precisely where we needed to be. The mail-order bride, rejected for being too sickly, had found not just a man who valued her worth, but her own path to a life of meaning and purpose, a journey that had required her to be cast aside before she could truly be found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.